Tuesday, December 4th, 1956. Memphis, Tennessee. It probably seemed like just an average day, but later that afternoon, an impromptu jam session would occur that would forever live in infamy, thanks largely in part to the quick thinking of a studio engineer. At the time, the great Carl Perkins was working in Sun Recording Studios attempting to come up with a follow-up to his smash hit, Blue Suede Shoes. The label's owner, Sam Phillips, decided to bring in one of his newest signings in an attempt to inject some new life into the project. That person was an unknown piano player and singer named Jerry Lee Lewis. As luck would have it, a few hours later, none other than Elvis Presley himself stopped by the studio for a visit. This was exceptionally strange, as Presley was no longer signed to Sun Records, but he was still riding the waves from his appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, and it can be easily argued that at that time, he was the most famous musician in America. After chatting it up with Phillips for a while, Presley listened to the playback from Perkins' session, enjoyed it, and then went into the studio to talk with the musicians. Shortly thereafter, Sun Records' own rising star of country music, Johnny Cash, joined the others in the studio as he'd been there to observe the Perkins sessions. The four musicians talked and joked with each other for a while, and eventually a jam session of sorts broke out, with Carl Perkins' brothers providing the rhythm section. Thankfully for posterity, the legendary Cowboy Jack Clements was the engineer in the studio that day, and he decided to hit record during the session, unbeknownst to the musicians in the studio for a majority of the time. At some point, Sam Phillips realized the potential he had for publicity due to the musicians he had in the studio, and called a local newspaper. The photograph that was taken that day of Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis remains to this day one of the most iconic images in all of music history. During the session, more than 50 different tracks were recorded, though most of them were incomplete or just tracks of the four musicians chatting with one another. This proves just how informal the sessions were, as well as the fact that for a majority of the time, they had no idea they were being recorded. Strangely, none of these tracks were made available until the 1980s. But since that point, nearly every single moment of the sessions has been released in one form or another. In 1982, the group reunited for a one-off session minus the deceased Presley, and more than half a century after the initial incident, the entire story was turned into a Broadway musical aptly titled $1 Million Quartet. While there have been many amazing groupings and pairings of musicians all throughout music history, you can easily make the case that due to the spontaneous nature of the event, as well as the caliber of the musicians involved, no other can hold their own against this one, and they define the true meaning of the term supergroup.